Mr. Smith stopped at the edge of the room, as if stumbling upon a poorly kept secret. He had left the office in silence and was walking towards the library when the muffled sound of footsteps on the wooden floor caught his attention. The salon, which used to be closed during the week, had its doors ajar. He peeked out instinctively. Inside, the sun was dancing. James was spinning through the space with improvised but soulful steps. Next to him, Emma, a black woman who worked in the kitchen, led the rhythm with firmness and precision. The light from the ceiling marked movements on the polished floor, creating reflections that seemed alive. Neither of them realized they were being watched. Mr. Smith felt his chest tighten with something he couldn't name. He couldn't look away. That didn't make sense. That shouldn't be happening. Stay until the end to discover how this simple dance scene shattered years of silence and strict rules. The story of James and Emma will surprise you and show you that sometimes all it takes is one step to transform everything. James seemed light, focused, whole. He hadn't seen himself like this in a long time. Since the loss of his mother, the boy had closed himself into a kind of emotional routine, acting more out of inertia than will. Mr. Smith had tried to fill that void with rules, schedules, and security. But now there before him it was something else. The sun smiled as he danced, and it was not a discreet smile. It was wide, true, and whoever was with him wasn't a teacher or relative. It was Emma, that woman who until then passed almost invisible between the rooms. Emma was discreet and efficient, but with a past he had never bothered to learn about. And yet, it was she whom his son now followed with admiration in his eyes. That destabilized him more than he would like to admit. What was Emma doing? Why did James seem so connected to her? And since when did that kind of thing happen without his knowledge? The discomfort wasn't in the dancing. It was in what it revealed. The son had a whole world that he didn't know about, and Emma was a central part of it. Mr. Smith walked away from the door with short steps, trying to understand why that scene bothered him so much. The house was silent, but something inside him had already broken. It was just the beginning and he didn't know it yet. But that morning would change everything, because from that moment on, the control he always believed he had over his life and his home would begin to slip away, and he wasn't anywhere near ready to deal with it. Mr. Smith did not return to the salon that day. He withdrew slowly, keeping his face impassive, but inside, the confusion was growing. He tried to get back to his office routine, answering messages and reviewing contracts, but the image of James dancing with Emma wouldn't leave his head. It wasn't just the gesture of the dance that disturbed him. It was what he had seen on his son's face, a free type of joy, which could not be explained by rules or achievements. It was an expression he no longer knew how to recognize. That scene reopened a space that he thought he had locked away a long time ago, and no matter how much he tried to ignore it, the discomfort grew in silence. In the days that followed, Mr. Smith began to observe more. He walked the corridors with increased attention, listened to fragmented conversations, and even slowed down when he passed near the kitchen. He was looking for signs, some clue that explained what was changing inside the house itself. James was different, lighter, more present. He didn't talk about Emma or the dancing, but there was a sparkle in his eyes that caused more concern than comfort. That transformation seemed to be beyond his control, and Mr. Smith didn't deal well with things he couldn't predict. Something inside him was beginning to close, not by logic, but by instinct. It wasn't just doubt, it was jealousy. It was the discomfort of seeing his own son trusting someone he never considered important. He began to remember Emma's gestures, her firm looks, her safe posture. She was just an employee, but her presence seemed to occupy more space than it should have, and that bothered him. A discomfort that mixed with the prejudice he had never allowed himself to admit, but which now became impossible to hide. He was losing space inside his own house, and even without proof, he began to suspect that there was something more going on between the two. And when this suspicion took shape, he decided he would no longer stand still. The concern never left Mr. Smith's mind. During a meeting, he looked away from the reports and fixed his gaze on a random spot on the wall, remembering Emma's gestures in the room. There was something there that wasn't improvised. The movements didn't look like someone who was just imitating or copying. There was technique. He had seen this kind of precision before. At lavish performances he was forced to attend for status. But there, in the living room of his house, with her uniform stained with flour and her hair tied up in any way, she had danced as if she carried that on her skin. That image didn't match the resume he received on hiring day, and now he needed to know, not out of curiosity, but because something deep down said that this woman was more than she seemed. Alone in his office, he advanced firmly across the keys. He typed her name without much care and filtered the results without expecting any big surprises. But then, he found an old, poorly indexed record of a regional event, an award ceremony with few well-known names, but one of the photos made him stop. There she was, younger, with impeccable posture, and eyes fixed on the audience. The caption said it all: Emma, awarded as a new dancer. He continued researching and found another article, this time from a larger newspaper, praising her performance in a national show. And after that, silence. No new information, no interviews, no goodbyes. A career that seemed promising had been interrupted for no reason at all. The void between that old news and his home kitchen began to bother him even more. The next day, Mr. Smith didn't wait for chance. He interrupted her activities without warning. Emma looked up calmly, without any signs of surprise. He showed the cell phone screen with the news open, the photo, the headline, the compliments. He didn't ask if it was her, he just showed. The silence between the two didn't last long, but the tension didn't need words. He wanted to know why someone with that background had agreed to work serving meals in that house. She stared at the image with a neutral face, in no rush to respond, and Mr. Smith, even without admitting it, already sensed that the answer would bring more than he expected, and maybe it messed with parts of him that had been locked away for too long. Emma remained silent for a few seconds, then looked away from the cell phone and gently placed the dish towel on the counter. Her voice was low, firm, without defense or pride. She said that dancing was not just a choice, but a bond she had with her mother. It was her mother who sewed the costumes with her own hands, who took her to rehearsals even after an exhausting day of work, who made her believe that talent could open doors. It was this woman who accompanied her at her first public performance, her eyes shining brighter than the spotlights on the stage. But her mother fell ill and left too quickly, when Emma was still too young to understand that the world didn't offer time for those who dreamed. After the loss, the house was different. Silence occupied the spaces where there had previously been encouragement. Her father, hardened by life and the bills that were piling up, demanded that she leave the stage. There was no more space for art. There were bills to pay, younger siblings to help, and dancing didn't bring food or relief. Little by little, the sneakers were stored at the back of a closet. The rehearsals became souvenirs, and the invitations stopped arriving. Emma didn't fight with her father. She didn't rebel. She just shut up. She started working early, never mentioning her old life again. That's how she learned to adapt, hiding what hurt, and that's how she arrived at that house, months ago, with a clean resume and restrained gestures. Mr. Smith said nothing. No questions, no judgment. He just stood there, still, in front of a story that forced him to review everything. He felt the burden of not knowing anything about who served his coffee, about who washed the dishes, about who shared moments with his son while he filled out spreadsheets and diaries. Emma's story hit him hard, not just because it was painful, but because it revealed how far he had become from everything human, even from his own son. And this silent and uncomfortable realization planted a doubt that would no longer leave him alone. Upon leaving the kitchen, Mr. Smith was unable to return directly to the office. He walked slowly down the long hallway of the house, now strange to his own eyes. He passed paintings that he had never paid attention to, portraits he didn't remember approving, and the main staircase, which at that moment seemed to lead nowhere. Everything was in the right place, clean, organized, functional, but inside something was out of order. It wasn't Emma's fault. It wasn't about her. It was about him, about how many times he had greeted someone with a nod without looking them in the eye, how many times he responded to his son's request with a brief gesture, or how many times he thought that giving everything meant just paying for everything. It crossed him in a subtle and profound way. There was no undoing what he didn't see, but now that he saw it, there was no more pretending. Mr. Smith began to notice spaces that he previously ignored. He noticed his son's favorite dish being served without reaction, the silence at dinner being broken only by the cutlery, and the way James disappeared through the corridors whenever he finished a sentence. He tried to make conversation once or twice, but nothing seemed natural. The son responded politely but kept his distance, as if there were an invisible wall between the two. It was then that, one afternoon, when James was walking down the hallway carrying his own sneakers, Mr. Smith forced himself to ask where he was going. James hesitated for a second, then replied without looking away. He said he wanted to dance, and he wanted to compete. It was at that moment that Mr. Smith realized how out of touch he was. He had no idea that there was a tournament scheduled in the city, nor that James had already thought about it. He tried to hide his astonishment, but something in the boy's firm tone made him pay attention. James explained that he had been training with Emma discreetly, that it wasn't just fun, and that she believed he had talent. The boy spoke seriously, with desire. It wasn't an impulse, it was a choice. Mr. Smith didn't know if he was more surprised by the request or by seeing his son supporting his own will with so much conviction. The answer took a while, but came with a firm tone. If he really wanted to compete, he would have to commit. No halves, no excuses. James accepted the condition without hesitation. Mr. Smith watched his son walk away lightly, as if lifting a weight from his chest. He stood still, listening to the footsteps disappear down the hallway, trying to understand what had just happened. He no longer saw himself as the man who imposed orders. For the first time in a long time, he was just trying to keep up. Later, he ran into Emma at the end of the day and bluntly mentioned the tournament. He said he expected seriousness in training, no games or temporary excitement. She just nodded, with firm eyes, and an expression that was no longer strange to him. That woman carried a past on her shoulders, but also a determination that he was beginning to respect. If you are enjoying this story and want to continue following other real and profound transformations, take advantage now and subscribe to the channel. The next videos will show you how simple gestures can change entire destinies. The following days revealed a side of Emma that few knew about. In the salon, sweetness gave way to technique. The commands were direct, the adjustments were precise. She corrected James's positioning with patience but without gentleness. There was no condescension, just requirement. The training began to shape the boy in a different way. More posture, more control, more resistance. Mr. Smith from a distance observed everything. He saw in his son's eyes the effort of someone who wanted to be better, and in Emma's expression, the professionalism of someone who found meaning again. But there was still something there, something invisible, that made him hesitate to believe that everything would go well. James woke up earlier and maintained a determination that surprised even Emma. There was no laziness or complaining. When he made a mistake, he started over. When he fell, he got up. The body, still immature for so much demand, began to respond to the rhythm. With each training session, resistance increased and movements gained firmness. There was no more hesitation in his feet, nor in his eyes. Dancing stopped being just a refuge and became a choice. Emma recognized that glow. She knew it was the kind of passion that can't be taught, and so she pressed, and shaped, with the same responsibility that someone would have when cutting something too rare to waste. Mr. Smith watched hidden, in the corner of the half-open door, or at the top of the stairs. He never went in, never interrupted, but he was there. He saw his son evolving in silence, transforming his own body into strength. The boy who previously walked the corridors with his head down, now walked with energy, rhythm, and expression. Mr. Smith noticed all this but didn't know how to fit it in. The approach seemed risky. He didn't want to break what was working, but at the same time he felt excluded. That world that appeared before him seemed inaccessible, even though it was built inside his own house. What bothered him most was not the physical distance but the connection between the two. Emma and James understood each other with gestures. She corrected with a look, he responded with concentration. When he got it right, the smile came loose, and Emma responded with a slight tilt of her head. There was no exaggeration, no open affection, but there was complicity. Mr. Smith could not understand where this intimacy came from. He felt small in front of her, as if he had lost the chance to be that haven for his own son. And no matter how much he tried to deny it, pride began to mix with a feeling that was difficult to swallow. At dinners, the silence was now filled with thoughts. James spoke more, with enthusiasm, about techniques, training, and even difficulties. But he spoke while looking at his plate or moving his napkin, never directly to his father. Emma, in turn, did not elaborate on explanations. She limited herself to reporting on the day's progress, always respectfully, but without trying to create bonds outside the room. Mr. Smith felt that something was slipping through his fingers. He was wasting space, not because of incompetence, but because of absence. And as much as he tried to convince himself that he still controlled things, he knew that this time, he wasn't the one setting the pace, and it was starting to hurt. And there, have you ever experienced something similar? A moment when you realized you were missing out on what really mattered? Comment below. I want to know if this story is touching you in some way too. The approach of the tournament began to change the rhythm of the days. The repetitions became more intense, the sweat more constant, and the breaks almost non-existent. James trained with focus, but there was something different in his gaze. It was no longer just effort, it was tension. On a night when training went on beyond schedule, he let slip a comment that revealed what he was carrying inside. There was another competitor signed up for the tournament, someone known for winning in previous years, an older, more experienced boy, with a reputation for being impeccable. James was not afraid of dancing, but of being compared, of not being up to par, of disappointing. Mr. Smith heard the confession by chance, as he crossed the corridor and heard his son unburdening himself in the living room, in a lower tone than usual. For the first time in weeks he entered, not to interrupt. He entered slowly, stopped near the door, and said only what was necessary, that it wasn't wrong to be afraid, that fear was not weakness, it was a sign that it mattered, and that the challenge only existed because he was ready to face it. James did not respond immediately, but the silence between the two was different. It carried a new understanding, without demands. Mr. Smith then left, without applause, without promises, but with something new in sight. The next morning the rhythm returned. Emma stayed focused on what needed to be fixed. She adjusted the details, demanded precision, insisted on the right time, but when the steps ended, she also offered breaks, moments of breathing. At the end of the last rehearsal before the competition, James fell sitting on the wooden floor, exhausted, sweaty, with his eyes looking at the ceiling. Emma didn't say he was ready. She only said that he had faced much more than that stage could demand, that he had overcome his own fear, the longing for his mother, the lack of support, and even loneliness. And that wasn't trained. That carried over. That night, Emma passed by the room where James was mentally reviewing his steps with his eyes closed. She didn't interrupt, just left a folded towel and a bottle of water on the table. He saw her leave and was silent. He was nervous, breathing unsteadily, heart racing, thoughts spinning. But there was something different this time. It wasn't the fear of making mistakes. It was the desire to get it right. And deep down, even without knowing what would happen the next day, James felt that what he had achieved so far had too much value to be measured in medals. Still, he knew the stage was waiting for him, and the real challenge was yet to begin. Finally, the big day of the event arrived. The theater was full, but James felt as if the air was weighing only on him. Behind the curtain, with his shoulders stiff and his mind filled with thoughts, he tried to control his breathing. The name of the competitor he feared had already been announced. He was the last contestant before him, and his fame was no exaggeration. When the rival entered the stage, silence ensued. His movements were dry, precise, almost mathematical. Each turn ended at the exact point, without wasting energy. The clothes shone under the spotlight, and the body seemed designed for it. At the end, the theater gave him an ovation without hesitation. James watched in hiding, with a heavy heart. He felt he would have to deliver more than technique. If he wanted to win, he would have to dance with something his opponent didn't carry. The announcement of his name came soon after. The sounds of footsteps, clapping, and whispering became noise. James crossed the stage with unsteady breathing and a fixed gaze. Mr. Smith was in the audience, stiff but with steady eyes. Emma to the side, not smiling, but completely attentive. The music started playing, and James danced, not out of obligation or vanity, but because that moment was now his. The long training sessions, the silent falls, the mother's absence, the days without answers, everything came out through the movements. The body was an instrument, but emotion was the engine. The feet obeyed, but the impulse came from within. When he reached the most difficult part of the choreography, he hesitated for a millisecond, took a deep breath and continued, then jumped firmly and landed lightly, precisely. The audience held its breath. Mr. Smith leaned his torso forward. Emma clenched her fingers in her lap. James finished with his arms open, his chest heaving, and his eyes fixed on some invisible point on the ceiling. The silence lasted for a moment, and then the theater burst into applause. On all sides, people stood up. Some shouted his name, others clapped while standing. James just breathed, standing still, trying to understand what he had done. The stage lights slowly receded, and he went backstage, his legs still shaking. He didn't know if he had won, but he knew he had given everything away. The wait for the result was long. The jurors whispered, looked at spreadsheets, and pointed out details on the clipboards. The presenter returned to the stage and announced the technical awards. James heard the names being called without paying attention. Best expression, best musicianship, best costume. Time seemed distorted. Mr. Smith was gripping the seat support with both hands. Emma kept her face firm, but her eyes were teary. When the moment for the main prize arrived, silence spread like an electric current. The presenter paused, and then he said James's name. He didn't react immediately. He looked around, hoping he had heard wrong. But the theater exploded. Someone gently pushed him forward. He walked to the stage as if floating without stepping directly on the ground. The trophy was placed in his hands, and he lifted it still in disbelief. From the audience, the father stood up. He applauded with a restrained expression, but there was pride there. pride and relief. Emma smiled, without exaggeration, with the serenity of someone who knew from the beginning. James took a deep breath. It wasn't just the prize, it was the recognition of a journey. And now, on that stage in front of so many people, he finally felt whole. James came down from the stage holding the trophy carefully, but his attention was not on the object. It was in what he felt inside. It was difficult to explain. It wasn't exaggerated joy, nor was it temporary euphoria. It was a kind of peace he didn't remember ever feeling. It wasn't about beating the other competitor. It was about overcoming his own fear. The silence from before, the insecurity, the doubt, dissipated there. The stage, which had intimidated him so much, was now the place where he found himself. He felt he had proven, not to the public but to himself, that he wasn't broken, that he could still dream, express, feel, and most importantly, that he didn't need to hide to be accepted. Mr. Smith watched him from afar, without immediately approaching him. It took a few minutes to leave the theater. On the way to the door, he replayed entire scenes in his mind. He remembered his silent son at dinner, the notes he didn't read, the conversations that never started. And now all that was coming to light without asking for permission. He had confused care with control. He believed that protecting was the same as defining. He tried to guide, but deep down he just imposed. Seeing his son shine outside of the pattern he created was like having a mirror shattered in front of his own feet. This time he saw the pieces and didn't try to glue them together. He just accepted it. And that for him was the beginning of a change that had no return. Emma remained in the theater longer. She sat alone in the seats in the last row after the audience left. She observed the stage still lit, empty but full of energy. She felt like something inside her had reorganized. She spent years avoiding everything that reminded her of the time she danced. She thought that protecting the wound was the same as forgetting it. But there, with James, she had relived something without having to go back to the past. She realized that her talent no longer needed to exist on stage. It now manifested itself by planting courage in those who needed it, by showing someone that the body can also be home, and that dancing was not a privilege. It was a right, a calling, and she had responded. Outside, Emma passed Mr. Smith on the front steps. Neither of them said anything. They just exchanged a different look, almost complicit. He didn't apologize. She didn't demand it. They both knew what had changed. The house they shared for so long, marked by silence and hierarchy, now carried other voices, other intentions, and at the center of it was James. The boy who danced was no longer just a son or a student. He was the link between two worlds that had finally seen each other, and he was also a sign that there was still time to start over. A few days after the tournament, James entered his father's office with the trophy in his hands and a sentence on the tip of his tongue. He said he wanted to continue training, not because of the competitions, but because he had discovered something that made sense to him. Mr. Smith looked up from the paper, silent. He didn't ask questions, didn't offer conditions, didn't ask for justifications. He just nodded, with a short and firm gesture, as if he understood that there are times when you shouldn't limit what has blossomed. For the first time, the father didn't want to mold. He wanted to allow it, and in that small gesture, something greater than any contract was sealed: true support. The days continued at a constant pace again, but now with a different atmosphere. James trained in the morning, went to school in the afternoon, and reserved the evening to review the most difficult sections. Mr. Smith began showing up more frequently at training, sometimes bringing water, sometimes just sitting in silence. The son no longer found this presence strange. It was welcome. The conversations between them started slowly, with short sentences, then became longer. Mr. Smith no longer looked at his watch all the time. He was there in one piece, and James, feeling this, began to trust more, not just as a son, but as someone who could be seen and heard without having to hide what he felt. Family meals were no longer silent. Sometimes James would talk about how the rehearsal went. Other times, he would talk about simple things at school. Mr. Smith listened attentively and asked sincere questions, and that changed everything. The rigidity that previously defined the relationship between them gave way to something lighter. There was no longer the weight of obligation. There was room for exchange, for error, for listening. The father, who previously thought that loving was protecting with control, now discovered the value of welcoming with presence. And the son, who had previously shrunk in the face of expectations, now expanded in the face of the freedom to be who he was. Emma continued to live in the house, but her presence had changed. The kitchen was still the space where she worked, but now it was also where they talked. Sometimes James stopped there to tell a new part of the choreography. Other times, Mr. Smith would stop by to ask something about seasonings that he had never noticed. Emma did not seek prominence, but her presence was noticed, respected, and valued. She knew her story had touched that silent house, and more than that, it had reopened doors that were locked not by a key, but by fear. One day, James asked Emma if she would dance in public again. She smiled and replied that she was already dancing, even without an audience, and he understood, because the stage she now occupied was different. It was made of listening, of exchange, of courage, and in that invisible space between teaching and welcoming, Emma rediscovered the meaning of her own talent. She was no longer just a former ballerina, not just a cook. She was the woman who rekindled a light in that place, a light that had once been there but that time and silence had extinguished. Mr. Smith started to feel more comfortable and increased the frequency with which he attended training, even without saying anything, just remaining there, discreetly leaning against the wall, observing in silence. His eyes said it all. They carried a glow that James had never seen before, a look of admiration, not demand, a contained but pulsating pride. During the pauses, the father looked more intently at his son, and James noticed. He noticed it in the subtle gestures, in the way he nervously adjusted his tie when he saw him complete a difficult sequence, or how he straightened up in his chair when Emma praised him out loud. It was as if they were finally finding a common language. James, even though tired, danced with more dedication when he felt his father's presence. It was different knowing that he was there, not as a supervisor, but as someone who really supported. One day, after finishing a difficult choreography, James instinctively turned to the door and saw him standing, with slightly teary eyes. There were no words, just a small nod, firm and emotional. That was enough. At that moment, James understood that he no longer needed to explain himself. His father saw him, in truth, and that was all he ever wanted. At the end of one of the training sessions, when the house was already silent, Mr. Smith entered the room. James was sitting on the floor, sweaty, tired, but his eyes were shining. Dad reached out and said that if he wanted, they could train together one day. The son looked surprised, then smiled. He didn't need anything else. In that gesture, everything was said. The house, previously marked by rules and silence, now breathed a new type of order, an order made of affection, respect, and presence. And it all started with a dance move, one simple step, but it had enough courage to change everything. We have reached the end of another story that perhaps touched more than you expected. If you felt something true while following this journey, tap the button that appears now and like the channel. This way you don't miss any new narrative that could mess with what really matters. In a few seconds, a recommended video will appear on the screen with another story that has everything to move you. And soon after, a special collection with stories that follow the same path of overcoming, transformation, and reconnection. Just click on the screen and continue with us. See you in the next video. Sometimes it all starts with a simple gesture and continues with the next click.